Also, I'm going to record this because I'm going to use it for another one of my classes as an idea, and we'll kind of keep moving from there. So good to see some of you. Happy Tuesday in Feb. Oh, most excellent. So talk a little bit about chapter six as an idea. And this idea around how you strengthen a company's competitive position. And let me be all it'd be really awesome if I share my slides, right? As an idea. Let's see. All right. Y'all good? See my slides? Excellent. All right. So talking about strengthening a company's competitive position, and like when we're there, I'm gonna kind of ask questions to get some of your thoughts and ideas around this to make sure that we are all ultimately tracking around this idea. And so this is ultimately a strategy course, right? Which we are trying to maximize the power of that strategy. As you think about all the things that we talk about every single week, it's really about how we utilize some strategic tools to reframe the questions and challenges that are in front of us, and how organizations think about those tools as creating a framework or a pathway for competitive advantage moving forward. That is the power of strategy ultimately for all organizations. And you want to make choices as an organization that complement what you do. And I've talked to you all about some organizations that have made choices about how to engage with other businesses, but haven't made all the right choices around decisions that would have allowed them to complement their business, to ultimately make them stronger and create that kind of flywheel effect around decisions that you ultimately make that help reinforce other parts of your organization that allow you to win. It's one of the reasons, quite honestly, that I talk a lot about Walmart and Amazon, because their strategies just continue to reinforce one another to be the everything store, or to continue to lower prices to bring more and more customers into their stores. And so for organizations, you can think about competitive actions either offensively or defensively as an idea, and we'll talk about them. Think about how the competitive dynamics are changing. And then also this idea around thinking around the scope of operations within the industry's value change. And, I always talk to you about how much change is occurring. It just doesn't stop for every organization, whether it's how customers think about shopping, tools they use to engage with your brand, all continue to have influence ultimately for organizations. And I think for a lot of companies, as they think about this idea around how they enhance their strategy over the long term, they have to start thinking about when do I really ultimately want to go on the offensive, what makes strategic sense, and when I need to employ some defensive strategies. And so I'll give you a microcosm of one of the companies I've done some work with. When they had new competitive companies, brick and mortar stores that were coming into their marketplace, they would think about what are the defensive strategies that I need to put into place that's going to allow me to compete. And so, as I shared with many of you, I've worked in the consumer packaged goods, food retail space my entire career. And when new competitors are coming, whether that's a new Whole Foods or a new Aldi or new Lidl or a new Walmart, there are playbooks that companies will put into place to defend. And so typically with one of the companies that I was working for, if we hadn't done a remodel in that store in more than 5 years, we made sure we went in and remodeled the store, make it as clean and fresh and friendly as it could possibly be, and have all the contemporary offerings. We would look at our pricing profile to make sure our prices would stand up to who the new competitive set was going to be. And about 12 to 15 weeks before they opened, we would think about, should we amplify our promotions? Should we do things to invite more customers into the store? What are all the things that we can do to deliver a great customer shopping experience and protect the business as best we can? Because the reality is, in a small part of a geography when a new store is coming in, population's not growing. So there's still the same amount of dollars that are available for the food class of trade. They're now being divvied up instead of three people by four. And so it always has an impact. And so we kind of had a defensive playbook that we used every time companies would come in. And we would always look at those playbooks and say, what are the things we should drop that aren't working as well as they used to? And what are the things that we need to amplify and work on? And how many of you are familiar with this idea of kind of this idea of first mover, fast follower, or late mover as an idea? So for most of the hands, I'm not seeing a whole lot of hands. I'm not seeing a whole lot. So it'd be good for me to spend like, a minute and a half talking about this. But this idea around being a first mover, a company that develops new technology, new product, new product or service for the marketplace, generally are coined this idea around being kind of first movers in this space. And it could have been around e-commerce, it could be around AI, it could be around new products and services, but being kind of the first in to ultimately develop that product and bring it into the market. There's plenty of companies who say, I don't want to be a first mover. I don't want to make all those investments. I don't want to invest in new technology, new business process, build new markets, communicate that out, and would ultimately be a fast follower. And then and that would mean that when that new product is developed, you can see how it does, and then quickly be able to come out with products that would closely mirror that. And I'll give you a couple examples, or you could be a late mover that you can kind of wait for the market to fully form and then ultimately decide to get into it. And so, as you think about being a first mover, clearly Tesla was the first automobile company or one of the first automobile companies to be. They were only an electric car company. They weren't a car company. They were only a EV maker. And so they had to rethink the supply chain. They consistently had to figure out how to engineer batteries to last longer and to build cars fundamentally different than combustion engines, internal combustion engines that were out there. And they built that business over, what I consider a short period of time. And the large automobile manufacturers like General Motors, Toyota, Hyundai, and all the others, they were content to wait because they weren't sure. They didn't know how big that market was going to be. It wasn't clear whether that was going to be a 3% market or it was going to be a 30% market. And the reason they wanted to sit on the sidelines was because of the investments that they needed to make. They had to invest billions of dollars in technology and new ways of working in factories to bring those products to market. And they didn't want to make those investments because, again, it was unclear, is this going to be a 3% market or is it ultimately going to be 30? And so they decided to wait for quite a bit of time. And then ultimately there were companies who came in very late on the back end of that. And, the EV market has been prognosticated as how quickly it was growing, how big it was going to be. And there were a lot of naysayers, and then it exploded. It was growing really, really fast. And now, quite honestly, sales are down, and lots of companies are taking write-downs. And the reason I bring this up is these are really smart people who work for General Motors or who work for Tesla or work for Hyundai. It's hard to predict customer takeaway and how that's going to be. And just curiously, just to make sure I'm tracking, why was it so hard for the automobile manufacturers to figure out and we'll stay in the US market because the international market looks very different. Why was it so hard for General Motors and Toyota and Honda and all the others to handicap how big that market was going to be and be able to effectively project out what that would ultimately be? Yeah, Jeff.
I know one major thing with electric vehicles specifically was there was a major rebate for purchasing electric vehicles, and once that went away, I know demand significantly decreased. I know Tesla orders for Tesla dropped. I don't know by the exact percentage, but I know they've dropped by a lot.
Yeah, no, that was definitely one of them. So for many, many years, the U.S. government handed out a $7,500 tax subsidy to offset the cost because electric vehicles cost more than internal combustion engines. The thought was it's important to get the customers to try this product. And so how do we ameliorate that price premium? And so they did it through a tax incentive for customers. And you're exactly right. When that very recently went away, EV sales they fell right off the cliff because those vehicles are all priced premium. Were there any other things that caused people to say, I'm not sure? Because again, these are highly sophisticated global companies who are tasked with forecasting market size, being able to understand consumer shifts. Does anybody know what some of the other barriers might have been for people to, I'll call it, get over the hump and buy an EV?
Is it the batteries?
Yeah, but is that you, Brian, who called that out, or was that Joe?
Yeah, that was me.
Very good. Yeah. What about the batteries? What do you know? But yes, it was definitely the batteries. That was a big part.
I just know they're like being made by like kids in Africa.
All
That's,
right.
I'm not sure if that's actually correct, but
Well, I'm going to build on the batteries because you're right. It was around the ability to build the technology to be able to take a bigger charge and to last longer. Because one of the things that was occurring, if any of you ever heard the term range anxiety, consumers are to this day very concerned about running out of energy, right? That their electric vehicle will run out of electricity and will not be able to get to where they need to go versus an internal combustion engine. Internal combustion engine probably has 400 to 500 miles range on the tank. EVs are a lot less. And the big thing is a lot of the companies thought it was a chicken and the egg. If more charging stations don't get built, less and less people are going to buy them because when they need to stop to charge their vehicle, there's not going to be charging stations there. And so it was as much about infrastructure as it was about product technology. And so there's been a whole host of things that the EV industry has been challenged with because when you think about it, right? If you need gas, I mean, I think there's three gas stations on the corner when you take a right coming out of TCNJ across from the 7-Eleven. There's three of them. So gas for all of us here in the Northeast and for the most part across the U.S. not a problem. And so infrastructure was a problem, product technology, premium pricing, and a completely new way of thinking about vehicles were all big barriers. And so a lot of companies said, I'm going to ultimately take a pause. And so just to kind of round out some of the rest of this slide, right? We talked about forward and backwards integration last week. And I think for a lot of organizations, companies also think about, are there any value chain activities that could be outsourced? And we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about those over the next, over the next hour or so. So there's a number of ways to start to think about this, right? Which is this idea around how do I launch, strategic offensives that improve a company's market position. And so I like this first one. I like it a lot. Focusing relentlessly on building competitive advantage and then striving to convert it into sustainable advantage. It sounds great. It's hard to do in real life, but continuing to focus on how do I build a better product and service that continues to have new augmentations that make it just a little bit better. You can also start to think about how do I apply resources where rivals are at least able to defend themselves. And so the example I always like to think about was Walmart decided they were going to get into the e-commerce business, but they decided they were not going to do it by Amazon. And it's funny, you look back now and you read stuff in the papers and it's like, it seems kind of like, oh, that's obvious. When Walmart started to talk about we're going to be a big e-commerce company and we're going to do it with our stores as the distribution hubs across the US, most people thought they were nuts and laughed and said Amazon's going to kill them. There's no way that they'll be effective at that. And they've proved over, probably since 17, 18, their run rate on e-commerce sales has been really, really powerful. And they thought, rightly so, the one thing we can do better than Amazon is we can create immediate gratification. People come to our stores, they can get what they need and they can get home. Whereas with Amazon at that time, when they started this plan, it could take 2 or 3 days to ultimately get your goods. So ways to think about it. And then the last one is displaying a capacity for swift and overwhelming actions to overpower your rivals, whether that's through pricing or advertising or new product technology for that. Curiously, I talk a lot about Walmart for a lot of obvious reasons. I always tell you they're target rich. What is Amazon's competitive advantage? If you thought about it for, a couple of seconds and said what it is that makes them great, right? Because and as you're thinking about it, they started as a book company. And so what have they been able to do to kind of create that competitive advantage over the long term? Yeah, Joe.
I would say you don't have to get out of the house. You could just order something right to you, and it'll be there in, like you said, 1 to 2 days.
Yeah, and so let's play that out, right? So if you wanted to sit back 10 years ago, 15 years ago as Jeff Bezos and said, we're going to make it easy to get product in a short amount of time frame, what strategy might and Joe isn't the sole one who has to answer this because he served up, a great answer, but what is it that Amazon had to think about from a strategy standpoint to be able to deliver that ability to get products to your doorstep quickly, almost as quickly as a traditional retail store? Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
I would say increase your warehousing and distribution network so that way you could easily ship products around to where you might need it most, like how
Yeah,
they have warehouses set up in every state, everywhere.
yeah. I think they have, I mean, I think they have 40 million square feet just in New Jersey, which is a million square feet is just an enormous amount of footage, and I think have 40 million square feet. And they had to consider other things. They had to think, not just think about warehousing, which is great, and then they started to have to think about, what is my distribution model? Do I own my own delivery mechanisms? Some of those things. And so they started to really think about that pretty broadly. And they have really been able to do that in a way that has overwhelmed their rivals. And I think about how they've overwhelmed their rivals. I mean, they changed the standard for all of us to think about. If it doesn't deliver for free, I'm not sure if I really want to pay for it. And I won't ask for, if we were in class, I would ask for a show of hands where I can kind of visually see you all. But I would hazard a guess that most of you have had a moment where you've put something in your basket and you saw the shipping cost and you've been like, really don't need it that much. Amazon destroyed that concept with their Prime membership and really reset the bar for everybody else that said, if you want to deliver to customers, you have to build in an expectation of extremely low or no delivery costs. And for them, they had to develop a strategy to offset that as well. So something really to just to consider as you start to think about what the strategies are. And as we talk in this class, and as you're starting to build out kind of your thinking around the work that you're all doing and the research that hopefully you've all started, this idea around getting one click lower of what are the things that, to make free shipping available, what must happen? What does that look like? And start to connect the dots around the strategy and then what the plan is that you would need to achieve that is going to be a really useful use of all of our time as we work through that over the next 10 weeks or so. And so for a lot of companies, they also start to think about what is what is going to be our basis for our competitive attack. And one of the things that good common sense, and I like to say this, it's easy sometimes to say in a classroom environment, good common sense, or to read history and say, boy, this would have made more common sense. But it should go without saying that if companies use Porter's five forces and they use some of the value chain work, they'll start to understand where their competitors are strongest and try to avoid directly challenging them in the places where they are ultimately strongest. Targeting Walmart on price for almost every organization around the globe is going to be a losing proposition because they move freight around the world cheaper than almost any other retailer that exists. So for most people to say that I would like to challenge them on price, more than likely is a long-term losing proposition that will probably destroy the company that's trying to challenge them for that. And so think through what makes them unique and what makes them really powerful. On the flip side, really starting to think through where are the places where I can ultimately attack my competitor's weakness. And so, a number of years ago, a really influential executive was hired at JCPenney to breathe new life into that brand. And he had a great pedigree. He had come from Target. He had also worked at Apple. And so he worked for some of the best companies in the world that were fantastic at design, really strong at innovation. And really thought through how to bring the business to life, and really started to think about how do I ultimately compete, and had come from Target and thought the best way that I can compete is to become an EDLP operator, everyday low price, really almost no promotions, everyday price. So the t-shirt's always $4. They never put it on sale, and thought that would be a great asset to use. The problem was that wasn't what Penny's was known for. It wasn't where they were strong. Where they were strong was in a high-low, promotionally driven, coupon-driven environment. Customers would come in with their coupons to buy more and more. And so he overlaid, his name was Rob Johnson, he overlaid Target's strategic plan in Penny, and destroyed the company in pretty short order. So understanding what makes you strong and understanding what makes you weak are really, really critical ideas and concepts. And more things for y'all to consider. So lots of ways to think about what is it that we should be known for. What are the tools we can use to play offense? If you can have better product at a lower price, pretty good place for you to ultimately win. And Hyundai has been using this for many years now to compete with a lot of the automobile rivals, and have used it to really great success. You can come to this idea around leapfrogging competitors by being first to market with new generation products. Intel did this for years with chips all through the 80s, 90s, and early part of the 21st century. They were continuing to be able to put more and more compute power on their chips on a smaller and smaller chip, and to double the compute capacity of these chips. And so they were constantly coming out with next generation products, and for a long time was able to dominate the chip market. Has not lasted deep into the 21st century by any stretch of the imagination. And then, if you want to work through this idea of continuous product innovation to really make your products, important to people. I think Apple has done a pretty nice job of this over the past 20 years. I think a better job when Steve Jobs was there, but they continue to innovate on their phones, innovate on their platforms, and try and make them a little better with each potential offering. What's the challenge around this idea around building continuous product innovation? What pressure might that add to an organization? Well, let's play it out this way. You're working for a company. You have a great product launch. You develop new technology that makes the phone better. Better screen, better battery. Apple's been better camera every year. What do you do next year if part of your cultural DNA is to be innovative?
Make the product better.
Yeah, and so what do you do? So like play that out in real time, because that's really what I want to talk through. So so if you want to make the product better and you say I need a better camera or I need better battery life, what needs to happen next? Because easy to say, what's the challenge to the organization?
You mean
Follow
like,
through.
Say that again. Yeah, Brian, say it again. I didn't pick it up.
he said follow through, but I was thinking like the same thing is like actually executing, and you gotta like go into the warehouse and make the product better, which costs money.
Costs money, and you also have to be able to engineer it, right? And so to make the battery longer, I had an old boss who used to say if it was easy, everybody would have it done already. So some of this requires engineering capability. So do you have enough engineers? Can you have the product technology breakthrough? And can you ultimately commercialize it? So this idea around innovation is not just around the idea, but how you action it. And what I give you just a thought. So Procter & Gamble has over 1,000 scientists on staff. They get rewarded by how many patents they develop. They developed Febreze in the late 80s. It took them a decade to bring it to market because they couldn't find a way to commercially develop it and have the product technology work effectively when it was dispersed, when it was outside a lab environment, but in the real world. And so they had this great idea, they had this great innovation, but they couldn't find a way to commercially produce it in a way that would be economical for customers to ultimately buy. And so this idea around innovation is really, really hard. You have the people who can develop the innovation. Is the commercial technology available that's out there? And can you develop that innovation in a way that is different from current offering that customers will give you ultimate credit for? And so I think a lot of companies really, for the most part, really struggle with how to build innovation into a pipeline over and over for the long term and truly develop innovative products. That's kind of my general take on this. But it's great if you can do it, but it requires a culture and an organizational standard that not every company can ultimately build. And then, you know, thinking about how you disrupt and innovate and create new markets. So lots of ways to think about how do we build an offensive strategy. And what I've seen is people want to talk about the words, but it's more important to think about how you action that lower within your organization to be able to ultimately bring that to life. So this one's an interesting one. Normally when I'm in class, I watch people, not everybody loves some of these slides, but one of the things that companies can start to think about, right, which is this idea around how do you build a competitive position. For me, that's code for how do I pick up market share? How do I have a bigger share of that market? Some of this requires you to think about, okay, which rivals should I attack from an offensive standpoint? And think through across that marketplace broadly, who's there? What do they do well? Where are their weak points? And where can I ultimately have success? And so there are times where there are market leaders that are vulnerable from a competitive standpoint. And most of you probably, I would think most of you don't even remember this brand, but BlackBerry was kind of the first smartphone that came out that truly allowed people, executives, to leave their office, essentially be able to take email with them, and still be pretty functional even if they were remote and not have to come back after a meeting and have 9 million emails that they still had to get to. But that phone was great from a security standpoint. Typing was relatively easy. It didn't do the internet well at all. There was no real apps to support it. Things like pictures, it didn't do well. And so even though it was a market share leader, a market cap leader, when Apple developed the iPhone, it put them on their ear and just destroyed that company because the smartphone did cameras better, did apps better, had a better consumer interface, was ultimately broadly easier to use in lots of different ways. And so thought about what's the work to be done? How do I solve it and make it better for the customer? They were able to do that. You also may want to take a look at what are some of the struggling enterprises on the verge of going under. One of my former jobs, when we would enter a new market, we would take a look at where were their weak competitors, and those are the places where we would consider to put stores, where we would amplify our marketing, and we would do our best to try and put them in a place that they would want to close those stores because then the customers would come to our stores very naturally. And then the last one I'll talk about is this idea around small, local, regional firms with limited capabilities. And if you read the history of Walmart, Walmart started in the middle of the country. They started in Bentonville, Arkansas, and then moved, kind of to the coast and globally over time. And they spent the first 20 years of their company's history really going into a lot of small local areas where there were, regional firms or smaller local firms, and they were able to demonstrate price leadership, better assortment, more well-run stores, utilizing technology and their vendor relationships to put a lot of those small local and regional firms out of business over time. And so they could enter these small towns and the five and dime would go away. The discount store would close up. The supermarket might ultimately close up, and Walmart would be the only game in town. And so they literally, for a long time, would put an inordinate amount of pressure on some of these smaller regional firms to build their business. So companies have lots of choices as they start to think about, how do I win in this marketplace? What do I need to look at? Where do I want to go play to win? And smart money is, compete with, don't try and pick the toughest fight first, but start to look at some of the weaker competitors or people who have vulnerabilities to try and grow the business. And then one of the more interesting places, and I truly mean this idea around starting to think about this idea around a blue ocean strategy, which is a different kind of product or service development that is available for an organization. This is a place where there's a market that really hasn't taken shape. There's no rivals. There's really nothing like it that exists. And so what makes companies and people so interested in this, when you say that the market is nebulous right now, there's also no rivals, which gives you pricing power. It doesn't give you a lot of ultimately competitive threats that are out there. And you can start to ultimately create demand for new types of new types of products that ultimately exist. And so lots of companies have existed in this space to start to think about businesses very different. And I'll use a brand that you might be familiar with, but Beyond Meat was a company that really started to fundamentally think about the marketplace very, very differently. They didn't say, I'm going to sell to people who don't eat meat. That wasn't their plan. They said some of those folks will buy our product, but they started to think about the market very differently. People who are willing to have meat alternatives, but were not averse to eating meat, and position their product against hamburgers, not as necessarily, vegans should come here to eat our product, but more along the lines of, this is a more healthy alternative that mimics or closely resembles what a beef product would ultimately happen to be like. And so blue ocean strategies are pretty interesting. Nintendo Wii is another brand that's an interesting one. So Nintendo Wii, when it came out, I remember when it came out, my kiddos were little. And if you were able to find one of these, you were a hero in your own house and probably the neighborhood initially for the first year and a half, because Nintendo couldn't produce enough of them. And it was a gaming console that created a new marketplace, which was based on motion, which a lot of them weren't. And the other thing is that it invited not just young kids into the equation, but it invited families in and made it safe and permissible for families to game together because of the way they designed their products. And it allowed them to, instead of looking at an audience that was X, it allowed them to look at an audience that was X times 2 or 3, because you can introduce parents and older people into the conversation to game with their kids. And so it really created a unique and interesting value proposition. For a number of years, they were incredibly successful. So talk a little bit about some defensive strategies that firms can also use. And so this idea around, how do you, I think about it as, how do I protect the house, right? How do I make sure that I can make sure that the organization is prepared to deal with a competitive onslaught so that we can survive and then ultimately thrive and prosper. And so this idea around defensive strategies are, how do I lower my firm's risk of being attacked? How do I make sure I lessen the impact? And how do I influence how do I introduce some efforts at other rivals? So you can do all sorts of things. You can think about how you create actions to um, block challengers and also signal a very strong likelihood of retaliation. And I'll do the second one first. This idea around a signal of strong retaliation, Walmart forever has said, if you lower prices, we will match your prices. They are on record in both their words and their actions. And so they say to companies who want to compete with them, if you want to compete on price, we will meet you head to head, item for item, locally in every market. That allows us to win because we've built in competitive advantage in our value chain through our effective distribution model that allows us to globally source products or use our influence and our size with our partners to extract a lower cost. That we're going to win. We're comfortable that we'll win every single time to do this. And so they like to go on to create that. It's not even an illusion, but create a clear barrier for a lot of firms. So there are also some pretty interesting things you can do to do some blocking from open challengers. Starting to think about how you introduce new features to models to broaden the product line and close off the gaps. Now, what I'll tell you is what I'll ask you to consider is sometimes I listen to folks and they talk about, these new features and new models and how effective they're going to be. It's really important to follow the consumer. Does the consumer want those products? Do they want those features? Does it fill a niche that really exists that is noticeable and appreciable for the customer to chase after? Amazon came out with a phone called Firefly a number of years ago, and they got into the phone business to compete with Apple, Samsung, and various other players in the market, and ultimately it was a phone that allowed for ease of shopping. It didn't fill a big enough niche. It didn't have features that were better than Apple and Samsung broadly. The phone literally was a wild failure in about a 6-month window, and they took an inordinate product write-down to liquidate all the inventory of those phones. So I would just say, and as you're thinking about strategies that you're going to put in place, one of the things I'll always ask you to do is what consumer problem are you solving based on what data, what is happening? One of the things that customers are looking for today from food products is protein's a big deal. That's a clear consumer need. You can see it in the data because more consumers are buying that product. And when there's consumer research that's done, more and more consumers are saying, I'm looking for more protein because it's a value to my diet, or I need more protein because I'm on GLP-1. But there's reasons to believe. And that becomes really, really important from an innovation standpoint to think about new features. New features for new features' sake doesn't ensure the win for a lot of organizations. You also want to think about how that can discourage buyers from trying competitors' products. So lots of good reasons to think about how you can put that in. So for some firms, how they signal challengers that retaliation is likely, publicly announcing its commitment to maintaining the current firm's market share. You could hear someone like Microsoft talk about our goal is to grow our cloud computing business, our Azure business, at a rate as fast or faster than the market. That becomes a very clear signal to everybody else in that space. They expect to grow, they expect to innovate, and they expect to win. And they may do that through aggressive deals with clients, and they may do that through more research and innovation. But if they are starting to make those public pronouncements, understanding that that's a big driver for them, that signals to the market that they're in it to win it for the long term. Still have to deliver, but it starts to put the market on notice. I talked about this idea around pricing, but I talk about Walmart all the time. This was going on in streaming with Netflix and Hulu and Disney and all of them as well. It happens in a lot of industries where they start to compete on price very, very quickly. And for some organizations, making sure you have a significant amount of cash on hand to protect the business, and then ultimately making sure that you have strong counter responses around this. need to know when you're going to make the moves and what moves ultimately to make. And moving first is no guarantee for success. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. So there's this idea around first mover advantage that's really, really powerful. Starting to develop products ahead of the market. And so if you go back in time, and I know this is a long time ago, but there was a CEO who was working for Procter and Gamble in the early 90s, and he was convinced they were going to develop products that customers didn't even know they wanted. Those are not my words, those are his words. He said them publicly. Great bravado, this idea around I'll develop products that customers didn't even know that they wanted. And they rolled out a whole host of new product offerings. And he thought that would give them better pricing power. It would burnish their reputation as a company that was being innovative. And because they were going into categories where there were no obvious competitors, they could long-term be more profitable. And for most public companies, the perfect storm is growing top line sales and growing bottom line even faster to improve ultimately your profitability. And that's highly rewarded for public companies. And so they spent a lot of time developing lots of new products, and they developed a product that was going to help. They came out with Febreze, which got odors out of clothes, which has been wildly successful. They developed Crest White Strips, which brought teeth whitening to the masses for what was a fairly fair price versus what it would cost if you would to go to a dentist and buy that service. And they also launched brands like Dryel, which was home dry cleaning, which was a miserable failure and a bust. So as you start to think about a company that wants to pioneer and develop new products and kind of be the first mover in a product category, whether it's EVs, whether it's on-demand movies, any of those other things, because Netflix did this as well when they went from competing with Blockbuster to going to discs in the mail to ultimately going to streaming. When companies think about this pioneering, what are some of the things that they have to think about and be concerned about from an investment standpoint? So let's play this out a little bit. So Netflix used to send CDs to my house. I would go online and I would select 20 movies, and I'd put them in the right sequence, in the sequence I wanted them. And I'd watch the first two on a Friday and Saturday night. I'd put them back in the mail. They would then send the third and fourth movie in my queue. And this would just kind of repeat itself over and over again. They had a great business model. They had engagement with all the movie houses to get all of that product. They had a deal with the post office on how quickly they could scan those items and get more discs out faster to the customer. And then they decided we're going to eliminate that business and we're going to become a streaming company. I would consider that pioneering. There was nobody else who was doing that then on a broad scale. What did Netflix have to consider as they took a really secure, profit producing, consistent revenue generation business, discs in the mail, to we're going to make this product available online? And keep in mind, this is 20-ish years ago. What's one thing that they had to worry about?
I would say like the risk like going into moving like something that's already been working to something else.
Yeah, so listen, I just talked to somebody about this on my way home from work tonight, which is this idea, don't fix what's not broken, right? I think that's kind of the theory you're talking about. So hey, listen, great revenue producing, consistent revenue producing. I'm good. Let's kind of keep going. Is there anything from a technology standpoint that might have been a challenge for them, do you think? Ever had a movie not fully play, run slow because your broadband connection isn't good? Anybody ever had that happen to them? It was they developed a technology to be able to download movies in chunks because there wasn't enough broadband across the US to download that movie in one fell swoop. So that it would download in pieces so that you would never get that buffering anymore. that would allow you to have a great customer experience, because there's nothing worse than getting to the crescendo of the movie, and it starts to buffer, and you can't get the voice, or you can't get the images. And so they had to make sure that they built the technology to ultimately be able to do that, and to deliver it. And they've been first mover and pioneering on a number of different things, whether it's been using machine learning and artificial intelligence. They literally changed the thumbnail of the movies on the screen based on who they think you are, knowing that if they change the image, they get better click through and better watch rate, because they are all about how much time people spend on their platform, and a number of other things that they put in place. And so for them, they had to build out all the engineering technology to be able to deliver a great customer experience. If they couldn't figure that out, people wouldn't continue to buy the service. And they've been um, wildly successful for the better part of the past 25 years, at least in my opinion. Um, so some other things that people can think about, this idea around if you can build an early lead from a pioneering standpoint, build a new brand, build a new business concept, it allows you to, it's the fourth one, move down the learning curve faster than rivals. So learn about the business, continue to take costs out of your organization, continue to innovate on the products that you offer, that it kind of gives you a head start to ultimately building that business. That's where a lot of people are in AI right now. They believe they need to continue to invest, to continue to build the models, to continue to have an early lead that's going to allow you to develop more sophisticated models, more effective models for people. So there's a theory around that's going to allow them to ultimately stay ahead. The other thing is this idea around if you can start to set the standard for the industry around kind of what the technical standard is. And there's a whole host of examples around that for an organization. All right, so sometimes for organizations there is a realization that it's a better idea to wait and imitate offers if there's no real learning curve benefits. And so, as I've said, I've been working in the food industry, consumer packaged goods industry, my entire career. And it is amazing how quickly new products can be copied. Whether it's, a version of yogurt, almond or cashew products, meatless burgers, different delivery tools for cleaning chemical products. It's not really that hard to imitate those offers. And there's been countless examples of companies who have sat kind of on the sideline, and they think and they watch the market, and they watch as things develop, and can develop strategies to bring those products to market pretty fast, and be this idea of what's called a fast follower. Watch the market develop, and then very quickly become a fast follower and develop and bring products forwards. There are countless examples of people who've innovated and they bring primitive products to market, things that don't ultimately live up to buyer expectations. And that's my my BlackBerry example. It was a great innovative product, but in a lot of regards, as the market started to develop, their tools started to look primitive versus Apple products and Samsung products, and ultimately didn't really deliver against what rapidly evolving buyer expectations ultimately came to be. And there is also this idea around when there's uncertainties in the market, and make it difficult for firms to ultimately succeed. There is a lot of talk now about how a lot of these EV vehicle manufacturers, many of them are not going to make what I'll call the turn into profitability, whether it's companies like Rivian and there are others, because there seems to be a lot of market uncertainty about ultimately how big that market's going to be as we move forward. And And so that always goes back to kind of this fog that companies are in. The fog of how big AI is or how big e-commerce will be or various other product technologies. And so a lot of times companies will be more than happy to sit on the fence, so to speak, and not roll into that marketplace until the what's called total addressable market size of the market is more clearly understood, and understand where their brand can fit in and how their company can be successful. And for smart companies to think about, can we compete in that market truly and be profitable over the long term? And so as companies start to think about this idea around whether they should ultimately be first movers or not, one of the things that companies should start to think about is, are complementary products or services, are they available? Does it require new infrastructure to make sure that we're ultimately successful? Do buyers need to learn new things? Do they need to be trained to ultimately understand what this looks like? And are there high switching costs? And so I talked to you about kind of infrastructure around EV vehicles, which a lot of people thought was a big damper here in the US for broad adoption of EV vehicles, and thought that that would continue to be a damper until the infrastructure for EVs was built broadly across the US. I was fortunate enough to spend some time out in Silicon Valley at a couple of pitches for companies, and there was a company that came in to talk to us. It was pitches in the consumer packaged goods space, and it was a company that came in that had developed a process, a natural process that you could spray on fruit and vegetables. That it wasn't chemical based; it was all natural, so there was no impact on the consumer consuming this. And when they sprayed this product on the products, it would slow down the aging process, because when an apple gets picked or a banana gets picked or any other piece of fruits or vegetables, it literally is dying from that moment on. They've been removed from the field, nutrients no longer start to go in, and produce broadly, a significant portion of it ends up in landfills. It goes bad, it spoils. Either it's not handled properly or it doesn't sell as effectively. And so this company thought there was an unbelievable market for being able to slow that process down. So they were able to spray peaches and extend the life of those peaches by, say, 3 to 5 days, which was an enormous amount of time for that product category. And so it meant less product in landfills, and it became more profitable for the companies who were selling these products, because they were able to reduce what's called their shrink, or product that they end up ultimately throwing away. For them, what was a real problem, there was no infrastructure in the produce industry for this product to be sprayed. So every farmer would need to have that when the stuff was coming out of the field or when it was going to processing centers. And so they had great product technology, but didn't have good relationships with all the processors to be able to get all those products ultimately coated. And to this day, they're still having a really slow ramp up, because they really need the infrastructure to be there before the product can be widely used. Everybody understands the business proposition, but it's been really, really slow to get the processors to invest. And the reason is the processors don't want to invest because they've been unable to go to the people that they sell to and say, instead of paying $100 for a bushel of peaches, I need you to pay $110. The end customers haven't truly understood the value or been willing to pay for the extra processing, even though there'd be significant cost savings to lots of different companies. So lots of times having the infrastructure there can be a real big barrier to broad adoption. And so the one of the last pieces that I'll talk about around this is this idea around kind of the scope of operations for an organization, which is, what is the horizontal and vertical scope of a firm's operations? Take a look at all the range of activities that are performed internally, the service that you offer, what your geographic coverage is, and what the competitive footprint looks like. It's really the third kind of column of things that I'm talking about in this chapter that allow you to ultimately maximize strategy. And so lots of different ways to start to think about this when you start to really wrestle through your kind of your scope of operations. And as you start to think about this, lots of ways for firms to think about how they can become stronger and more powerful. They can merge or acquire, right? This idea around a merger is combining two firms together into a single corporate entity, take on a new name, and away you go. There seems to be a move right now of lots of mergers from the past 10 years are being undone across a lot of industries, which is truly interesting to me. Or you can go into acquisition mode, where you go acquire another organization. Both are fine, and I'll talk to you about both of them and how they can be utilized more effectively. So this idea for mergers and acquisitions, a number of years ago, Ahold was a company. It's a Dutch company, food company. They own Stop and Shop and the Giant Company out in Pennsylvania and the Giant Company down in Maryland. They wanted to continue to merge and grow their business. And so they merged with a company called Food Lion, which is kind of tip of Delaware, but for the most part, Carolinas on down. EDLP operator, the other brands are high-low operators. And they merged these two companies, and you can see kind of the geographic coverage when they put Hannaford, Giant, Stop and Shop, and Food Lion all together. They covered a lot of the Eastern Seaboard. And they thought they could be more cost efficient. They thought they were going to take hundreds of millions of dollars out of their organization to be more efficient. When companies merge and think about this, what does it mean for them to be cost efficient? What does that ultimately mean? What are some of the things that they're looking to be more cost efficient on? All right, folks. This is what I would call a softball. I know we're not in class together, but let me say it again in case you didn't pick it up. When companies you think about mergers and acquisitions, and they talk about cost efficiency, where does a company get cost efficiency when two companies either get together through an acquisition or a merger? How would they become cost efficient? Because it's not because they put the two companies together. Where do they get cost savings?
Taxes.
How so? All right.
So as one,
Good.
yeah, I was gonna say, so as one entity, they're only taxed as one entity as opposed to being taxed, like being double taxed.
Okay. Let's keep moving for the time being. I'm kind of making a note. I always joke with you guys, I use a pencil to write everything down. That's actually not a lie. I'm working from home tonight, so I have a pencil. So, Joe, you had your hand up?
I was gonna say by cost efficiency, you mean like trimming the fat, trimming the duplicates that all the companies, they could combine their processes and then trim the fat for whatever they don't need.
Yeah. And so by trimming the fat, I interpret that as you don't need two CFOs, you don't need two CMOs, you don't need two presidents, you don't need two heads of advertising. And so you find that duplicative roles are broadly eliminated within the organization, which allows you to take cost out of the system to ultimately make the two firms combined much more cost effective. This clearly talks about how it expanded their geographic coverage, which allowed them to cobble up all of the East Coast. Some firms start to think about this as gaining quick access to new technologies and other resource capabilities. Lots of organizations have what I refer to as the secret sauce. The Ahold organization used to have a banner called, or a portion of their company called Peapod Labs, which was all their digital initiatives. And they were very effective at building apps, building e-commerce platforms, and thinking about digital as an enabler to customer engagement. And so they thought that these two companies, they could leverage that Peapod Labs in a really meaningful, really meaningful way. And for this particular company, they thought they were going to expand their buying power, which was going to give them greater influence that allowed them to buy trucks cheaper because they were going to scale their business, to buy all their supplies cheaper, to work with all their manufacturer partners and be able to buy goods at a cheaper pace. They thought the size of their organization would allow them to very broadly have great influence to lower their costs, and literally thought that they were going to bring in hundreds of millions of dollars in savings. This one did not work out the way they had wanted it ultimately to, because they didn't get the warehouse efficiency, the labor reductions at store, the productivity increases they were looking for. They didn't ultimately come through. On the flip side, I've talked to you about Amazon buys Kiva, which is a robotics company, and it allows them to literally leverage that technology to be one of the biggest robotics companies in the world, and quite honestly on the world stage. It's allowed them to continue to invest, to continue to scale their business without adding significant costs within their organization. So there's, when companies get together, these are some of the reasons they get together, right? New technology that they couldn't get, maybe get them into industries that they weren't, open up their geographic coverage, become more cost effective. Those are the reasons companies ultimately talk about why they ultimately want to bring that forwards. And this is ultimately sometimes why mergers and acquisitions ultimately fail. And many of them do not live up to the promise that was initially portrayed when the two companies either merged or one acquired another. May find out that the cost savings that they thought were far smaller than expected. That Ahold did not get the procurement savings that they were hoping for, and the influence with all their trading partners that they thought they were going to ultimately see, and they weren't able to leverage the scale of the organization to drive costs down as fast as they wanted to. And sometimes the competitive capabilities don't always materialize in a real meaningful way. One of my favorites around this is culture is a really, really big deal. And some of you will see this in your career. You will work for organizations that either get acquired or merge with others, and you'll see the impact on culture or operating systems or management styles that just don't mesh and have an impact on organizational members. I was working with a company who was using price optimization software to manage prices using technology, and also for understanding what every price move meant from a dollars and cents standpoint, from profitability, revenue, all of those types of things. And they were a great, great company. When we had a question and we were working with them, they would make their chief science officer available. If we said, hey, listen, we don't understand how this works, and this is our business problem, they were an inquisitive organization that wanted to solve customer problems. And they would literally put their scientists and engineers on the phone to help us work through some of those, because they thought it was a way to improve ultimately the products and services that they offered. And they were a learning organization. Well, 2 years after I started working with them, not for them, but with them, they were acquired by a very large multinational organization. Their product got embedded with a bunch of other products and services that they sold. And the entire sales team that I knew, every single one of them left. They were going to work for a great, great Fortune 50 company, and all of them hated it because they weren't allowed to sell the way they were. They weren't allowed to work with their customers. They were no longer nimble to develop new products and services. When we were papering the deal, signing the final contract, the CEO flew in to close the deal. That didn't happen in this new company. And so the culture was so opposite of what they were used to, and they felt stifled. And every one of those people that I knew all went to other startups or smaller companies. They wanted to be nimble and they wanted to develop new products very rapidly. And so it was just a bad cultural fit. And that happens a lot of times where you just don't have this good organizational fit. And the worry is, as part of your merger or acquisition, is around acquiring people who are smart and develop great products and services, and they don't culturally fit and leave. You lose some of the value of that merger or acquisition, and ultimately key employees are lost. Lots of times, managers overseeing the integration make mistakes, bringing the two firms together, either not recognizing the culture classes, or when it gets to stitching these companies together and it gets down to doing the work, it's a whole lot harder. In 2000, long time ago, I know for many of you, AOL, which was this fast growing internet company, at the time, and was kind of the, everybody was talking about, merged with Time Warner because Time Warner was an old fashioned TV company and they wanted to understand digital and they understood that's where the customer was going. Ultimately, Time Warner paid $165 billion to acquire, and at the time, it was the largest merger and acquisition deal in the history of time. And there were huge cultural clashes. The business models ultimately proved that they wouldn't work. And ultimately, 2 years later, 24 months later, the company took $100 billion write-down for a failed merger and acquisition. These are smart people who are running huge global businesses. And so it happens. It happened with HP. It happened with Snapple and Quaker Oats. It happens day in and day out. And so companies really need to think through, what strategic issue am I solving for? What are the organizational challenges? And the hard part isn't pulling the deal together. The hard part is stitching the two organizations together to truly get those improvements in value chain and the unlocks in culture to get that done. So I think I talked to y'all last week about this a little bit, so I'll touch on this very quickly. Vertical integration, right, is this idea around taking a look at the value chain and thinking about how do I integrate across multiple segments of the value chain. And it can extend you in either range, right? So Apple was a manufacturer, moved into retail, moved forward in the value chain. Companies like Target and Walmart are retailers who move backwards into the value chain to become manufacturers of butter, clothing, milk, various other items. So you can move either way in the value chain to build integration strategies that the idea is to make you stronger as an organization as you move through the integration of those. And so you can be partially integrated or you can be fully integrated from the standpoint of where you are ultimately in the value chain. So at the end of the day, this type of vertical integration really is you want to add materially to the firm's capabilities. That could be technological, improves your competitive position, or ultimately improves the firm's profitability. And so that's how companies should think about how they integrate either forwards or backwards into the supply chain to be successful. Apple got into retail and they control every bit of retail, what the stores look like, the associates work from Apple, but they haven't vertically integrated all the way back. They don't produce their phones. They have outsourced their phones to Foxconn and other companies who have a core capability of building these phones in a very advantageous way, cost competitive standpoint. And so companies have to think about what are the parts of the value chain that they want to own, and ultimately where can they be successful. And so where you can get scale economies, that's a great place and have a low cost advantage. And when you can ultimately match or beat suppliers' production efficiency with no drop off in quality. I always like to say, this is a great idea, but when you're competing with people who manufacture X product, milk, cheese, batteries, doesn't matter to me, you pick it. If that's not your core business, it requires a special company to be able to move into the value chain and say, I want to go into the manufacturing business, not necessarily the retail business, and be better than everybody else in that space and not lose anything in ultimately quality. Lots of reasons for companies to start to integrate backwards, reduction of supplier power. You start to reduce reduction in costs of major inputs. You can guarantee supply flow, and ultimately there may be some proprietary know-how that you will ultimately get from that. And same idea around why you integrate forward. One of the things that I think is brilliant about integrating forwards is if you go fully forwards in the value chain and get access to end users, there's real power in being closer to the customer, understanding what they buy, what their challenges are. And I'll just play out the Apple piece. Apple used to sell through Target and Walmart and Best Buy and other retail chains. Those companies had no reason to share data with Apple. Customer inquiries would go to Best Buy or go to Target.com. Direct access to the customer was managed by those retailers because they own the relationship with the customer. As Apple started to move forward into retail stores, they became the company that had access to the customers. Think about how much data they garner from their Genius Bar around things that aren't working, problems with software, hardware problems that are starting. They'll learn about those challenges much faster than they would if they didn't have direct access to those customers. They have a relationship with those customers to be able to target them directly, speak to them directly. So getting access to end users is a real power move for companies that want to move forward in the value chain and get ultimately closer to the customer. It can also be a pretty powerful way to reinforce and build brand awareness. It was one of the things that Apple wanted to make sure that they could elevate the value of their brand, continue to position it as a premium brand, their stores through the service, through how they were designed, that allowed them to continue to reinforce the premium product that they were ultimately selling. And so Steve Jobs felt very strongly about owning the retail experience to make sure that they were delivering a premium experience attached to what they believed is a premium product. So the last thing I'll talk about is the idea around disadvantages of vertical integration. There is big capital investments. You think about how much money Apple had to pay to get into retail stores if that didn't work out, or companies who buy manufacturing capabilities because they're going to produce their own products. Those are big investments that tie up capital for an organization that they could use that capital to do other things, right? They can buy back shares. They could invest in new technology. They could invest in people. They can do a lot of different things. And so when they invest all this capital, if it works, it's a great idea. If it doesn't work, it creates challenges around the P&L that shareholders typically don't really appreciate. And the other thing that I think is really important is this idea around acceptance of technological advantages or more efficient production methods. That company I was talking to you about, this price optimization company that we were working with, they worked with 15 to 20 customers around the world, and they had a pretty big business. And I used to believe that every time they rolled out their next update from a product technology standpoint, it wasn't my ideas. It was the ideas of 20 different companies that delivered really effective solutions that help manage the business more effectively. I was talking to a board member at the time who said to me, we were spending $1.5 million a year. I go $1.5 million a year on the product between people and product. And he was less than pleased that we were spending that much money. And he said to me very directly, we could have built this. This isn't that sophisticated. And I remember saying to him very clearly, you're right. We could have built it. The only problem is we wouldn't stay contemporary with how the business is moving. and being exposed to 20 thought leaders across the globe means the next iteration is their iteration is going to be way better than our iteration that was going to come out. And so I think for some companies, if they don't stay contemporary of what's happening in the marketplace broadly, for that price optimization company, that's what they did. For some companies, if we just did it as a project, we wouldn't be nearly as nuanced and versed in what was happening across the globe and what solutions were out there to bring new products and offerings to the market. So the other thing is sometimes when companies think about this, they may not get to the production levels that are necessary for them to get the economies of scale that they ultimately need. So I work with a lot of different companies who want to roll out their own private label products, their own brand version, but for many of them, they don't have the scale that's necessary to achieve the cost efficiencies of a Walmart or a Lidl or another. So this all comes down to resources and the resources that you want to put in play for your organization. And the one thing I'll leave you with is, for leaders of an organization, every one of these things that we just talked about is a bet. It's a bet around people, product, technology, and making sure you're making the best use of those people, your cash and cash equivalents, and the technology that you're putting into the market. If you don't get these pieces right as you think about, potentially vertical integration. So if you have this folly to get into retail and it doesn't work, you've wasted a lot of time, money, and resources that doesn't allow you to focus on what's really important. So for some of these companies, they see a competitive advantage if they don't effectively deliver against that. It's money that was potentially wasted and takes the company away from solving probably bigger problems that they need to deal with. So I think for all organizations thinking through, can we really be effective in moving up the value chain either way? And being effective and competitive is a really important thing to think about, because sometimes they just think about small pieces of it, but they have to think about long-term, can they win? The rest of this chapter is around outsourcing. Please feel free to read it. I won't be talking about it for tonight. It's a couple slides, but it's something worth taking a look at. So let's stop sharing this so I can see y'all. Does anybody have any questions for me? I do really appreciate when I can actually see you versus only seeing my PowerPoint presentation. Any questions for me? All right, so I have my computer says 7:20. So we'll take a 10-minute break. I'm going to cover chapter 7 briefly. And then I'm going to be interested to hear about what you thought of the Surratt paper that I sent you, and how you thought about it from your organization that you are thinking about writing your paper on. So I'm going to jump off camera for I'll be back on at 7:30. So see you in about 10 minutes. Share my screen again. Let's see. All righty. All good? I'll see chapter 7. Yeah. Awesome. All right. So it's really this chapter is really discussing how companies compete in international markets. And so high level, as you think about international markets and how companies can enter foreign markets. For me, first and foremost, it's around access to new customers. I had a running joke or a theory around this that when the Berlin Wall came down in the 80s and East and Western Germany combined, and all of a sudden I was convinced there was a lot of Eastern Germans who were coming across to West Germany, and the people who were running the other way into Eastern Germany and other parts of Europe were really companies like Procter & Gamble, Pepsi, Coca-Cola, because as those markets started to open for the first time or very broadly, it allowed them to gain access to new customers as those markets developed much more consumption patterns that could exist. And so if you were the Gap, if you were Pepsi, these were finally customers that you were able to get some access to open up new opportunities for revenue. Most firms are forever looking to expand their revenue and customer base. And so, it's why companies for the early part of the 21st century were very focused on late 90s into the early 21st century. China and India, because of the sheer size of those markets, both significantly north of 1 billion people. Markets like Brazil, as companies start to think internationally, how can I afford or how can I find growth? They started to look at some really, really big markets to ultimately continue to expand. And one of the benefits of all this expansion is allows you to get some economies of scale, which allows you to spread your fixed costs across greater volume, which ultimately allows your lower your unit production costs. And so for a lot of firms, this is a great way to continue to improve your profitability, improve factory utilization, those types of things, potentially expand or increase your purchasing power. For some organizations, it's going to allow them to gain access to low inputs of production. So, Walmart in the 80s was a company that had made in the US all over their stores. Today, I would hazard a guess you won't find any of those. And they have really looked broadly across markets all across the world to find the lowest cost inputs of production to be able to continue to make products available to their customers at a lower cost than many of their competitors. So lots of reasons for firms to think about ultimately how they can enter foreign markets. And the one thing I know for sure is that as companies think about how they expand beyond their national borders, it makes building an effective and efficient strategy significantly more complex for every organization that starts to think about this as an expansion tool. There are for sure, as you think about countries, they bring very different skill sets. There are certain things that will allow them to compete more effectively. And so competitors and competitive advantage starts to ultimately change. China has an unbelievable manufacturing base that allows them to produce very efficiently, very effectively, and have significant labor advantages for sure. As you start to think about companies who start to think about this, what's the challenge for some of these social media companies today in today's current world as they start to think about beyond the national borders of the US, because many of them are US-based companies, not all of them, but many of them are. What are some of the things as they compete across national borders that's going to make strategy very complex for someone like YouTube, Snapchat, Meta, and fill in whoever else you'd like to add to that. What are some of the challenges that they're going to have to deal with? I know a way around this. Okay. We'll keep moving. So I'll talk a little bit about, I talk about Michael Porter in this class quite a lot. Michael Porter has written so much. He's been a prolific writer, academic, who has written an awful lot about, we talked about Porter's value chain last week. We'll talk about the Diamond National Advantage is another topic that he's written on. Really, it's around this idea around how do I think about strategy? How do I think about my competitors? How do I think about what I do well? Conditions for success, really starting to create, I liken it to a framework. It's a way of thinking and forecasting and building out what's happening in the marketplace to make some of these strategic choices start to become more visible and more obvious for organizations. And so Porter has this diamond model. What's really interesting about it is it helps companies predict which companies or foreign countries are most likely to come to the market. It helps companies decide which foreign markets to enter first and choose the best country location for different value chain activities. And so he does a really nice job of starting to tee that up. And there are lots of examples of lots of organizations who have thought about all different markets that they would like to get into and thought they've had the perfect business model that would allow them to win and has really allowed them to have great success broadly. Lidl, if you've never been in one, there's about 150 of them here in the US, predominantly here on the East Coast. They're a wildly successful global organization that competes all across the world and has had tremendous success. They took their stores that have been successful in the UK, successful in Germany, successful all across Europe and into parts of Asia, rolled the same store base, design, look, and feel here in the US. It's similar to an Aldi, which has been wildly successful here in the US. And they've gone through 5 presidents in 10 years. They've been unable to build momentum and traction that allows them to win. And so when I talk about this, it all sounds good on paper, but even highly capitalized, very effective organizations can enter into other markets that cause them really some significant challenges. As you start to think about this idea around a framework for how to think about, there are, location advantages that people need to really start to think through. As companies start to think about what are my opportunities from a location standpoint, it might be better wage rates, better worker productivity, energy costs, environmental regulations. All of these start to play significantly into companies to say, if I produce somewhere else, what are the benefits for my organization? It might be a proximity to technology or industries that may exist, or to customers, better distribution costs. I was amazed when I was doing some work in China, and we went out to a number of different factories, and we were looking for kitchen products, bakeware and cookware and things along those lines. And we were out in a number of factories in kind of the central part of China. And what struck me was all these factories that were set up to produce the types of product that needed clay and clay type products. And all the big companies were there because there was a proximity to the raw materials that were necessary, and there was a workforce that knew how to work with these products, and they were able to effectively manufacture these products due to the proximity to raw materials and highly skilled workers to be able to develop very, very effective, efficient products, cheaper and more well built than in many, many other places in the world. And so companies start to think through what my location advantage ultimately may be. And this idea around fewer environmental regulations, dependent on the country that you're working in, they may have significantly different and lower regulations, and companies will talk about some of these regulations end up costing them a lot of money. And so the ability to think about producing somewhere else in the world offers them a flexibility and a cost reduction that could be considered very useful. So companies start thinking about what is the benefit of me being on the ground here, wherever here happens to be. And there's a whole host of reasons to consider different geographies to build that. There's also some thinking around government policies and economic conditions in host countries that could be ultimately beneficial. The tax rate, tax incentives, site location development, worker training all start to play into it. There is no doubt some of the negatives for some of these host countries can be equally difficult. It's funny, for most of my career, I spent little or no time ever talking about tariffs, and that seems to be dominating the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times every day. And you're seeing now we had a period of time globally where tariffs and quotas were significantly reduced. There were significant treaties like NAFTA and others that really eliminated a lot of this. And you can start to see now there are consequences to all these for organizations: who absorbs the tariffs, the effect that it has on the cost of product, what quotas might exist. And so all that starts to have an impact for organizations, and to consider what that may look like, and also what happens with minority ownership limits, and how profits get repatriated back to organizations. There are some countries in the world where you can't have more than a certain percentage of the company. Maybe it's 20% of the company that can be foreign owned, and the rest has to be owned domestically. And so there's all sorts of policies and procedures. Why do governments have so many different levers that they push around taxes, loans, environmental regulations, import restrictions? Why do countries even play in this space? And why do companies need to pay attention to it? Yeah, Ben. Your hand up, Ben?
Sorry, I was muted.
No worries.
So obviously, environmental regulations, kind of looking at that first one.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the country and the government cares about how the environment is, and
Mm-hmm.
making sure that businesses also care about the environment and don't put their profits above it is a big deal about why they care.
Yeah, for some, right? No doubt about it. Making sure that regulations are there, so there's clean water, clean air. Just it translates to all those for sure. And that comes with more regulations, requires more compliance, which drives the cost for organizations up. Not a good or a bad, just it is, right? It's just an understanding the business model that you're going to have to operate in. And those environmental regulations not followed can come with fines and things along those lines. So each one of these can have an impact on how an organization ultimately starts to think about this. Political risks. So this is a fascinating one, and there are if you have instability and you start to think about what countries do I want to go to, and if you have a board that says, thinking about 4, 5, or 6 countries that you might want to go to, whether it's because your brands work well with that consumer group, there's a natural synergy by selling your brands in that country, effective supply chain, any of those types of things. You also have to start to handicap some of these other challenges that might be in front of you. Doesn't mean you don't go into that country or part of the world, but you certainly have to handicap ultimately what the risks are. And so the instability of the host government, will your intellectual property be protected? Will your workers be safe? Could your business be nationalized? These are all things that you have to ask, is it a possibility, and what is the possibility that happen? Because there's a history across the world as companies enter into new countries. There are history lessons of where these things have happened. And this idea around nationalization or expropriation can be a thing. It's happened in the oil and gas industry, countless different countries this has occurred in. And if there's some kind of internal political unrest, does it put your people in danger? Is there potential in contraction of the market? These are all things that companies have to work through, and certainly want to try and minimize that risk to the best of their ability while protecting upside growth as a company. And this idea around instability of the monetary system and the economic conditions is, a really, really big deal for companies as they think about where they're going to invest and where they're going to try and grow their business. There are countless examples of countries who've had kind of runaway inflation that impacts consumer spending and creates great economic turmoil. This piracy and lack of protection is one of my personal favorites. There was an Apple store in China not too long ago that was operating and running on there was only one problem. Apple didn't own them. And because property rights are not protected in the same way in every country. This isn't a good or a bad, it's just a fact. There's a continuum of property rights and how they're protected legally around things like trademark, copyright, and whether your ideas and intellectual property can be protected or can be stolen. And so companies have to really think through, if I move into this part of the world, whatever part of the world that is, will my intellectual property be protected? Will my brand be safeguarded? And if not, you have to consider if that makes sense. Because today, in certain countries, if you steal trade secrets, there's economic, there's risk to you as a person. There's jail time. There's fines for the organization. If that's not protected or thought about in the same vein in other places, you may want to consider whether you ultimately want to go there. Particularly if you're selling something that your IP is what you own. That is the most important part. It's not because you produce at a lower cost. It's not because you have the best marketing firm in the world. It's because you have some technology that allows you to compete in a way that's very different. That gives you your success. You want to make sure you can protect your intellectual property. And as an idea. So exchange fluctuations in value create exchange rate shifts, and it is, you'll listen to firms talk about the value of the dollar, what's happening with currencies around the world, and how you repatriate your profits, and all of that can have significant headwinds for your organization and create a little bit of financial. I call it irregularity, but I don't mean it in anything untoward, but more just kind of those fluctuations make it difficult to effectively forecast out. So as you start to think about the considerations, right, for an organization, as they think about broadly, I want to enter this market. And right, it doesn't matter what home country you're sitting in, but as you're thinking about entering new markets in other parts of the globe for your organization, you want to start to think about, as I think about where are the right places to expand and expand my business and my brand, I have to start to think about my product offerings. Do I need to customize those? Do I need to and develop those to meet the local buyer's needs and match their tastes? Or am I going to continue to produce my product? So I'm going to produce a bottle of Tide in a 50-ounce container, and it's going to be orange and it's going to say Tide. And that's how I'm going to go to market. And you have to choose kind of what your pathway is. What's the risk or benefit in pursuing either of these?
I would say one of the like it's gonna be more expensive if you're changing it just for like a certain like country compared to like if you're doing it all the same like globally.
No doubt, because as you start to change your line offerings, as you start to create all that variety, it will drive up your cost in research and developing new items, maintaining multiple forms of inventory. You get less effectiveness in your manufacturing because you stop the lines more often. And so, for sure, as you start to pursue this customization of offerings, it starts to increase your cost structure. Any other risks or benefits for either of them? Yeah, Joe.
I would say a risk for changing your product to customize it for preference of local buyers would be if the local buyers simply don't like how you set it up because, culture is intricate, culture is hard to understand.
Yeah.
Maybe that's something that you can't replace. Like, I'm thinking Taco Bell in Mexico. It's not going to work out well because the culture there, you can't compete with that on a fast food level. And it's so entirely different that it's not even considered Mexican food.
Hmm. I see. So not getting the local market right and delivering products that are doomed to fail. Um, I get it. For sure. There's a lot of risk. What would be true? What would have to be true to provide that level of customization? What would companies need to know? And that's not Joe, directed at Joe. That's for all of you. So you have this great idea that you are going to customize products for the local market. What must a company know to be able to do that?
I was gonna say like looking at maybe someone else that's done it like internationally before you and seeing like how it worked for them.
Yeah, for sure. So my mother says that's the ultimate form of flattery, copying someone else, and so it always makes me laugh when I say that. So for sure, you can. That's kind of like a case study, right? Brianna, go ahead.
I was gonna say like what the cultural preferences may be, like what their values are, so you can meet them, and whether that's like religious or their social norms in that area, you kind of have to match to that as well.
Well done. No doubt. You need to know thy customer. I like to think about it in that way. And so it's a really important thing. And so that requires you to do more research, be more expansive in what the consumer need state is, kind of country to country to country. In the US, we wear a white wedding dress. In other countries, it's different colors. And I know that's a simple example, but just understanding those nuances of color and words and usage of products all become really, really critical aspects of ensuring that you have product success. So all these are there's not a I like to say sometimes these are strategies that one can use, and sometimes it's not about this one's better than the other one. It's not about the concept. It's about ultimately how you execute, how well thought out the process is, what needs to be true for your organization to win, and can you effectively align your organization to support them. And so as I start to think about when you customize offerings, right, does it allow you to get better market fit and consumer appeal? Does it more closely align with local tastes? They say, yep, I get it. When I was, when I've been in other parts of the world, I've walked into a Pizza Hut, I've walked into a McDonald's, I've walked into fast food places, and both of those brands allow local market customization that's reflective of what consumers want. And there's some things that are on the menu that are the same everywhere they are in the world. And so they've built in this model that allows you to have better market fit. Hopefully, if you're going to go through this idea around customizing offerings, you're going to be able to differentiate from your competitors by offering those locally relevant products that lets you cut through the clutter and connect with them on the brands that are important. And I think the other thing when you flip the side of this around, this idea around some kinds of customization, you talked about the high cost and complexity. It also starts to create longer lead time to the market, and ultimately you want to make sure that you're aligned kind of with kind of core strategy of the brand and the company about what you're trying to get done. So I don't think there's a bad one. I mean, I could ask you to argue that in an essay exam, and you could pick either side of the coin and get the maximum points as long as you kind of thought out some of those as a concept. Lots of ways to think about the primary modes you can use for entering a foreign market, right? You can continue to produce in your home country and export those goods, put them on a plane, a train, or a boat to get them where they need to go. You can go through licensing, where you license foreign firms to produce for you. You can build a franchising model. You can establish a subsidy in a foreign market, or you can develop some strategic alliances. Again, each company has to start to think through what's the framework I want to use, what makes the most sense for me. And as I talk about each of these, you'll see that each one has its own reasons to make it strong and effective. And you just have to decide for your organization ultimately which one is best. And so this idea around, kind of being an exporter, low capital requirements, you continue to get great economies of scale because you're producing out of the factory where you're producing all those other goods. And so hopefully you're just growing your volume not introducing a lot of customization. And so it gives you greater and greater economies of scale as you're producing more and more units, and your manufacturing facility is a fixed cost. Doesn't it require you to make any direct investment overseas, or and so that also keeps your capital requirements effectively low as a concept. What you have to also then start to think about is, what's it going to cost for me to get it there, wherever there happens to be. If you have to put on a plane, a train, or a boat, there's a cost to distribute it, and some of these methods of distribution also can be a little tricky from a timing standpoint. If you're buying something out of China and it's coming on freight overseas, it's got to get to the freight forwarder in China. It's got to get on the boat. It's got to cross the seas, and then it has to go through the port here. It has to clear customs. It has to get then delivered to a distribution facility before it's even available for sale. And there's pieces through that supply chain that you don't have direct control over, which changes your deadlines. And why I bring this forward is, if you're selling something that is seasonally based and you missed a season or you missed a portion of the season, it introduces enormous risk to you having product that people don't potentially want. So, think about a summertime item. If you missed a window and don't have it in the appropriate stores at the right time, do you miss the window to ultimately sell that? Is kind of the idea as you think about it. Clearly, there's been an enormous amount written in the past couple of years around the impact of tariffs. And, I've listened to people talk to me about the product was coming from this port going to that port. And while it was in transit, tariffs were applied, and there's a 15% tariff. And so the item that cost, the freight that I have coming over, instead of costing 100,000, now costs 115,000. And companies may or may not have the pricing power to be able to pass that. Get customers to pay more for it, or on the flip side, absorb it in their P&L. And so those are very real-time risks that are happening right now. If you listen to this weekend, Supreme Court knocked down tariffs that were in place. The White House came out and said, we're going to have 10% tariffs later in the day, and over the weekend came out and 15% tariffs. If you're in the exporting business right now, you're trying to figure out what that means, who's paying for it, and are they still going to want the product? So, these are real world examples of things that are happening real time for organizations. And this idea around loss of channel control, for me, is an interesting one. You don't have direct control over how products are getting distributed in country, how they are getting represented. You don't own the retail environment. And so you don't have the same level of control that you may have ultimately domestically. You can think through this idea around licensing fees as a concept, which companies can utilize. It's great, right? If you're going to license or franchise, low resource requirements. You don't need to manufacture it or produce it. You may be licensing your trademark, licensing your IP, so other people produce it. So there are hundreds and hundreds of companies just in the US alone that work with Disney. Disney doesn't produce all those plush toys, don't produce all those lunch boxes or backpacks or clothing. They license their IP and they get paid a fee. And they don't have to spend any time in the manufacturing business or the transportation business or any of that. And so licensing can be a really, really powerful tool and not require a lot of resources on the licensee or the licensor to the licensee. You get all that income that comes in. And it would allow you, in theory, to expand into markets very rapidly, because you would not have to be encumbered by finding a manufacturing facility, finding a distribution facility, finding retail partners. That's for your partner to figure out. Certainly, how you maintain control over your IP is really, really important, and how people ultimately represent your IP. Disney is a machine making sure that their characters are always protected, and how people utilize those, and they will stop companies from not having them represented in the right light. Not every company is Disney and has kind of the capabilities and the reach to be able to support that. You lose operation and quality control because you're not manufacturing. You have to hope that your partner if there's a problem with the lunchbox or the backpack, that they will remedy that and not ship that and not display the Disney brand in a bad fashion. But you don't ultimately control the quality that they are putting out. You can paper it with a contract, but again, can be very tough to enforce and see broadly across the universe that you're trading in as real challenges around licensing. So real strong financial advantages. It can be very asset light, but will struggle potentially with some control ideas. You can develop a foreign subsidiary as a strategy. Lovely if control is what you're into, right? Like if you are like, I want to make sure my quality is good, pricing is done effectively, my brands get merchandised in the way that I want. A foreign subsidiary is a wonderful tool to give you that control. It starts to avoid entry barriers, so things like tariffs and some of those regulations, not necessarily come into play because you're operating within that local country. And it gets you access to some of the firm's skills. Everything, I like to think of this as each one of these starts to amplify or elevate or bring risk into a higher level. The risks become, in my opinion, financial, start to become more significant. You're going to have to have a cost to acquire these companies. There's also a complexity around acquisition. All the things I talked about culturally before are even more amplified when you have a foreign subsidiary. If you are not on the ground in that country, if you don't have a degree of management control, if you don't have really strong oversight, because typically they can be operating in different time zones, different cultural norms, different thoughts around what is acceptable and not. Not a good or a bad, just a reality of some of those differentiations that are out there. And so, when you start to think about companies who are using foreign subsidiary strategies, Coca-Cola they have subsidiaries in over 200 countries worldwide. I mean, that's pretty much everywhere. And it allows them to produce and distribute their products locally. And it still allows them to maintain, that Coca-Cola powerful brand name, which is one of the most iconic and recognized brands in the world. Procter & Gamble, people who make Oil of Olay and Pampers and Tide and brands like that. They have subsidiaries in over 80 countries. And McDonald's, which last count I have 38,000 restaurants globally, have subsidiaries in 100 countries. So it can be a really effective tool, I think, for most organizations. Making sure there's kind of guardrails around the organization is pretty important. You can also go into build some form of alliance or joint venture strategy as an organization. Great benefit around an alliance or joint venture is you gain partners' knowledge of local market conditions. Very quickly, they give you an on-ramp into what's important locally, what's different about the culture wherever you are operating in a way that you might not have been able to get nearly as quickly. It allows you to get economies of scale through joint operations pretty quickly, allows you to share distribution facilities, and really start to think about your rivals that you need to work through and what that looks like. And so this idea around a benefit of alliance or joint ventures is really powerful. Nestle and General Mills, two gigantic consumer packaged goods companies, have gotten together. They are cereal partners worldwide. So General Mills makes things like the Cheerios, Lucky Charms, brands that you are, very familiar with, Chex Mix and some others. So they have this great intellectual property. They are very effective at making cereals. It's a category that Nestle doesn't necessarily compete in directly or in a very significant way, but Nestle has a great global distribution model. So they formed a long time ago in the early 90s, utilized global distribution with General Mills cereal expertise to penetrate markets across the board. And it's helped really expand Cheerios and other businesses dramatically. And so lots of companies think about them. PepsiCo and Unilever. Now, PepsiCo is Frito-Lay, Tropicana, we used to be Tropicana, obviously, Pepsi, and Gatorade, got together with Unilever. Now, Unilever is Ben and Jerry's, Hellmann's Mayonnaise, but Unilever got into, they've had Lipton tea forever, and they wanted to get into what I'll call liquid instead of just tea bags, and really wanted to lever their ready to drink tea business globally as an idea. This is what Lipton wanted. And so they got together with PepsiCo and leveraged PepsiCo's distribution capabilities broadly across the globe. Think about a company that's really good putting liquid in packages, and they use them to really expand the Lipton brand broadly across the globe. And so lots of firms go through and work these ideas as a way to try and scale, mitigate risk, and utilize what makes each of them great to scale their business through joint operations, and allow them to win in a faster way. There are, like everything, right? Strategic alliances can introduce a whole host of risks. One is you're not one company, you're two companies that may be driven by different key performance indicators, and different strategy execution that may look a little different. Some of the things you have to watch out for is, do they really have the knowledge and expertise that it's going to allow you to expand your offerings significantly in that market? Make sure you can work through, some of the cultural and language barriers that exist. You have to have there's a cost to establishing the arrangement. You can have conflicting objectives. There's lots of different things that can happen. And so I was talking broadly 3 minutes ago about Pepsi and Unilever with Lipton, really, really successful. Well, Pepsi got together with Mueller, Muller, through a dairy partnership, and they wanted to enter the U.S. yogurt market with Mueller Quaker Dairy. And it was an abject disaster because the marketing was terrible for it. The style of yogurt that was brought to the U.S. was very different than what U.S. customers were interested in. And there was incredible competition from the likes of Dannon, Yoplait, and Chobani. And ultimately, the JV was dissolved. I remember I was actually in the business, managing a bunch of that business when that happened. And the fanfare around it was unbelievable because Mueller was convinced that PepsiCo was going to be a game changer for them to open up doors that they couldn't ultimately get in otherwise. And it was an abject failure. And so there was another one where Dannon and a company called Wahaha got together. And ultimately, Dannon wanted to expand their bottled water business and dairy business in China. And this is crazy. But at the same time that they signed the agreement, Wahaha secretly created parallel operations and excluded Dannon. They also wanted to have their own water business. And so they were getting together to leverage each one of their scales, but one of the partners was also secretly trying to build their brand at the same time. And it ended up with a huge legal battle. Both companies' reputations locally were kind of sullied during it, and Danone ultimately exited the alliance, severed the relationship. So all of these come with a degree of risk. And like everything, organizations have to handicap, how are they going to win? What does that look like? What are the financial risks? What my possibilities of success? What challenges do I have to watch out for? And one of you had alluded to earlier, kind of looking at a playbook that others ultimately utilize to win as a way to enter foreign markets. So I put up like 40 slides. Where I just ended is where I end. There will be no essay, no short answer, and no multiple choice past anything that I covered. There are other topics that are covered in the chapter, but you can stop where I stopped. So I'll leave it right there. Any questions for me? Because I'm interested in what you all have to say. In 1 second, I just want to open up the assignment that I passed along in for tonight, which was a paper written by a company called Surratt. Let's see. And okay, Zoom. And there we go. So, who wants to give me who can tell me what they thought about the article, what they found interesting about it, and then walk me through kind of what I had asked you from an assignment standpoint about reframing the company that you're thinking about. Yeah, Ben, go ahead.
So when I read the article, I thought it was really interesting about how sometimes companies don't fully realize what business they're actually in. There's this very famous movie about McDonald's. I forget the exact name of it, where Ray Kroc comes in and says, "You're not in the fries business. You're not in the fast food business."
Throughs would be the best thing going and what they would need to do that. And they couldn't connect any of the dots to what that would mean from the organization. And what I mean by that is to be really good at drive-throughs, you need to have a menu that's fast, efficient, easy. You need to be able to build stores that are on the outside of buildings that you can fit with the drive-through, that they can go around. McDonald's has spent 20 years trying to optimize their drive-through experience, making it easy for customers to order. So there's like things that need to deliver on that idea. There's a bunch of steps that need to happen to give the organization a sense of success. And for all of you, that is what I'm hoping that you do, is that it's not, I don't want you to give me a creative idea without being able to explain how that idea makes sense from a customer standpoint or a business standpoint, and then how to action it as an organization to give your organization a modicum of success to actually be able to have that happen. And when I said to the group, I said, you do realize that it would probably take them 5 to 10 years to be able to actually operationalize that from a construction standpoint across their entire network. They're like, well, what are you talking about? And we talked about, they're like, well, that won't really work. That won't give us any great success in the short term. I was like, that's what we're talking about. And so that's the other thing that I would just ask you to all consider. At the end of the day, this has to drive tangible business results in a relative amount of time. So thank you for kicking us off, Ben. Anybody else?